The bride who never came. A rancher waits for his mail-order bride, but the stagecoach arrives empty, except for a letter saying she died on the journey. Then, a year later, a woman arrives claiming to be her. In the spring of 1887, Colorado Territory buzzed with fever of the gold rush, a land where dreams of wealth drew men and women from across the world, their hopes as fleeting as the dust kicked up by their wagons. The town of Clearwater sat nestled in a valley, its streets alive with the clatter of prospectors and the dreams of those who'd come to stake their claim. On a windswept afternoon, Caleb Morrow stood at the edge of town, his eyes fixed on the horizon where the stagecoach was due to arrive. His hands, calloused from years of ranching, clutched a letter worn soft from reading, its words promising a new beginning. A mail-order bride named Sarah Ellis, who'd agreed to share his life. Caleb was no stranger to loneliness. His ranch, a sprawling spread of cattle and open land, was a testament to his hard work, but it was empty of the warmth he craved. At 32, he was a widower, his first wife lost to a fever 3 years prior, leaving him with a quiet house and a heart that hadn't healed. The letters from Sarah, filled with careful script and quiet hope, had stirred something in him, a chance to build a family again. He'd waited months, sending money for her journey from Boston, picturing her face from the tintype she'd sent, a young woman with kind eyes and a shy smile. The stagecoach rumbled into view, dust swirling in its wake, and Caleb's heart quickened. He straightened his hat, his boots planted firmly on the wooden platform, and watched as the driver reined in the horses. The door creaked open, but no one stepped out. The driver, a grizzled man named Amos, climbed down, his face grim as he handed Caleb a letter. "I'm sorry, Morrow," he said, his voice low. "She didn't make it. Fever took her on the trail, somewhere near Kansas. This came from her kin." Caleb's fingers trembled as he took the letter, the paper heavy with a weight that belied its thinness. He didn't open it, not there, not with Amos's pitying eyes on him. He nodded, his jaw tight, and turned away, the platform creaking under his boots. The wind howled through the valley, as if mourning the loss of a woman he'd never met, and Caleb felt the familiar ache of grief settle deeper into his bones. He rode back to his ranch, the letter unopened in his pocket, its presence a quiet rebuke. That night, alone in his house, he read it by the flicker of a lantern. Sarah's sister had written, her words stark. Sarah had fallen ill on the journey, her strength fading with each mile. She died in a dusty boarding house, her last thoughts of the man waiting for her in Colorado. Caleb folded the letter, his hand steady but his heart unsteady, and placed it in a drawer with Sarah's earlier letters. He didn't cry. He'd spent his tears years ago, but the emptiness of his home felt sharper, the silence louder. The months that followed were a blur of work. Caleb drove his cattle, mended fences, and tended his land, his days filled with the rhythm of labor, but his nights haunted by what might have been. The townsfolk of Clearwater spoke of him with quiet respect, a man who'd built a life from nothing, but they saw the loneliness in his eyes, the way he lingered at the general store, hoping for news that never came. He stopped waiting for the stagecoach, stopped dreaming of a bride, and buried his hopes beneath the weight of his work. A year later, on a crisp morning in 1888, the stagecoach rolled into Clearwater again, its wheels creaking as it stopped. Caleb was in town, bartering for supplies, when he heard the driver call his name. He turned, his heart stuttering, and saw a woman step down from the coach. She was slight, her dress worn but clean, her auburn hair tucked beneath a bonnet. Her eyes, green and wary, met his, and she clutched a small satchel as if it were a shield. "Are you Caleb Morrow?" she asked, her voice soft but steady. He nodded, his throat tight, unable to speak. She stepped closer, her gaze searching his face. "I'm Sarah Ellis," she said, and the world seemed to tilt beneath Caleb's feet. He stared at her, the tintype from his drawer flashing in his mind. But this woman was different, older perhaps, her face marked by a weariness the photograph hadn't shown. "I know you got word I died," she said, her voice trembling. "It's a long story, but I'm here now." Caleb's hand twitched, as if to reach for the letter he'd carried for a year, but he stopped himself. The townsfolk were watching, their whispers a low hum, and he felt their eyes on him, on her. He wanted to ask questions, to demand answers, but her face, pale, exhausted, yet resolute, stopped him. She looked like a woman who'd fought to get here, and that, at least, he understood. "Come with me," he said finally, his voice rough. "We'll talk at the ranch." He gestured his wagon, loaded with supplies, and she nodded, her steps hesitant but determined. As they rode out of town, the wind carrying the scent of sage and pine, Caleb glanced at her, noting the way her hands gripped the satchel, the way her eyes scanned the horizon as if expecting pursuit. He didn't know if she was truly Sarah, didn't know what had brought her here, but he saw the fear in her, the same fear he'd felt when he'd lost everything. And in that moment, he knew he couldn't turn her away. The wagon creaked along the rutted trail, the Colorado landscape unfolding in a sweep of golden grass and distant peaks. Caleb Morrow kept his eyes on the reins, his hands steady despite the storm of questions in his mind. Beside him sat the woman who called herself Sarah Ellis, her small frame swaying with the wagon's motion, her hands clutching the satchel as if it held her very life. The wind tugged at her bonnet, revealing strands of auburn hair, and Caleb stole glances, searching for the woman from the tintype he'd carried in his heart for a year. She was both familiar and foreign, her green eyes shadowed with a weariness that spoke of trials he couldn't yet fathom. The silence between them was heavy, broken only by the clop of the horses and the occasional cry of a hawk overhead. Caleb wanted to ask, how had she survived? Who had sent the letter claiming her death? But the words felt like stones in his throat. She'd come to him, claiming to be his bride, and that alone was enough to keep him from turning her away. He'd known loss, known the ache of an empty home, and the sight of her alive, breathing, here, stirred a hope he'd thought long buried. "You must be tired," he said finally, his voice low, careful not to startle her. "It's a long way to the ranch, but there's a bed and food waiting. You can rest there." She turned to him, her eyes wary but softening. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't know if you'd take me in, after everything." Her fingers tightened on the satchel, and Caleb saw the tremble in them, the exhaustion she was fighting to hide. "Don't need to know everything yet," he said, echoing a kindness he'd learned from his late wife, who'd always known how to ease a burdened heart. "Just rest for now. We'll sort it out." She nodded, her shoulders relaxing slightly, and leaned back against the wagon seat. The ride was quiet, the landscape blurring past, but Caleb felt her presence like a weight, a promise he wasn't sure he could keep. He thought of the letter in his drawer, its words of death and loss, and wondered what truth lay between it and the woman beside him. Her face, though worn, held the same delicate features as the tintype, but there was a hardness there, a scar above her brow that hadn't been in the photograph. He pushed the doubts down, focusing on the trail, on the rhythm of the horse's hooves. The ranch came into view as the sun dipped low, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink. It was a sturdy spread, log house, barn, corrals for the cattle, all built by Caleb's hands over years of toil. The house was modest but warm, its windows glowing with the promise of shelter. He pulled the wagon to a stop, climbing down and offering his hand to the woman. She hesitated, her eyes scanning the ranch as if expecting a trap, then took his hand, her grip light but firm. Inside, the house smelled of wood smoke and fresh bread, a loaf Caleb had baked that morning. The main room was simple, a table, 2 chairs, a hearth with a low fire, but it was clean, the floor swept, the linens folded. Caleb set her satchel by the door, gesturing to a chair. "Sit," he said. "I'll get you something to eat." She sank into the chair, her bonnet slipping back to reveal more of her face. "You don't have to do this," she said, her voice soft but edged with fear. "I know it's strange, me showing up like this." Caleb paused, ladling stew from a pot on the hearth. "Strange or not, you're here," he said, "and you look like you've been through enough." He set a bowl in front of her, the steam rising in the cool air, and stepped back, giving her space. "Eat what you can. There's a bed in the spare room when you're ready." She looked at the stew, then at him, her eyes searching for something. Judgment, perhaps, or suspicion. Finding none, she picked up the spoon, her movements slow, deliberate, as if she hadn't eaten in days. Caleb busied himself at the hearth, adding a log to the fire, his back to her to ease her nerves. He heard the clink of the spoon, the soft sound of her eating, and felt a quiet relief. Whoever she was alive, and that was a start. When she finished, she set the spoon down, her hands folding in her lap. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice breaking the silence. "For the letter, for making you think I was gone. I didn't know they'd sent it until I got to Kansas." Caleb turned, his eyes meeting hers. "What happened?" he asked, his voice gentle but firm. He didn't demand, didn't press, but he needed something, some piece of her story, to anchor the hope stirring in his chest. She swallowed, her fingers twisting the edge of her dress. "I got sick on the journey," she said. "Fever, bad enough they thought I wouldn't make it. A woman took me in, nursed me back, but by then, my kin had sent word I died. I was too weak to travel, so I stayed in Kansas, working to earn my way here." Her eyes dropped, and Caleb saw the shame in them, the fear of being doubted. He nodded, his jaw tight. "You're here now," he said. "That's what matters." He didn't know if he believed her, didn't know if she was truly Sarah, but the weariness in her voice, the scars on her hands, told a story of survival he couldn't dismiss. She looked at him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "I didn't think you'd still be waiting," she said. "After a year, I thought you'd have moved on." Caleb's heart ached, the memory of his wife's grave flashing in his mind. "I know how to wait," he said, his voice rough. He gestured to the spare room. "Get some rest. We'll talk more tomorrow." She nodded, rising with a grace that belied her exhaustion, and took her satchel to the small room. Caleb watched her go, his eyes lingering on the door as it closed. He sat by the fire, the letter from his drawer heavy in his mind, and wondered what truth lay beneath her words. Outside, the wind howled, carrying the scent of snow, and Caleb felt the weight of her presence, a spark of hope in a house too long empty. The morning sun filtered through the curtains of Caleb Morrow's ranch house, casting a soft glow across the worn wooden floor. Sarah, or the woman who claimed to be Sarah, woke to the scent of coffee and the distant lowing of cattle, a world away from the dusty boarding houses and crowded trains of her past. She lay still for a moment, her body heavy with the unfamiliar comfort of a real bed, the quilt soft against her skin. The room was small, its walls bare save for a single hook holding a faded apron, but it was clean, the linens fresh, a testament to the care of the man who'd taken her in. Her heart thudded with a mix of gratitude and suspicion, the weight of her own secrets pressing against her chest. She rose, smoothing her dress, and stepped into the main room. Caleb was at the stove, stirring a pot of oats, his broad shoulders hunched as if carrying a burden he didn't speak of. The house was quiet, save for the crackle of the fire, and Sarah took in the details she'd missed last night. A shelf with a few books, their spines worn from reading, a pair of boots polished by the door, a stack of firewood neatly arranged by the hearth. It was a home built for one, yet it held a quiet longing, as if waiting for someone to fill its spaces. "Morning," Caleb said, his voice low, not turning from the stove. "Coffee's on the table. Oats will be ready soon." His tone was steady, offering no judgment, no demand for explanations, and Sarah felt a flicker of relief, though her guard remained up. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft as she sat at the table, her hands folding around the warm mug. She watched him, noting the way he moved, deliberate, unhurried, like a man who'd learned to measure his strength. She wanted to trust him, wanted to believe in the kindness that seemed to radiate from him, but trust was a luxury she'd lost long ago, in a life marked by betrayal and loss. Caleb set a bowl of oats before her, plain but steaming, and sat across the table, his own bowl untouched. "Eat what you can," he said, his eyes meeting hers briefly before dropping to his hands. "I'm heading out to check the herd. If you want to leave, the trail to town's clear. If you stay, he paused, his fingers tightening around his mug. There's work to be done. You're welcome to help or rest as you see fit. Sarah's throat tightened at his words, at the choice he offered without strings. She thought of the road behind her, the fever that had nearly claimed her, the months of scraping by in Kansas, the man who'd chased her from Boston, his threats still echoing in her mind. She didn't know if Caleb was her salvation or another risk, but the warmth of the house, the steadiness of his gaze, made her want to stay. "I'll help," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I can work." Caleb nodded, a flicker of something, relief, perhaps, crossing his face. "Good," he said. "There's a garden out back needs tending. Tools are in the shed." He stood, pulling on his coat, and paused at the door. "No one comes here without my say. You're safe." His words were a promise, simple but firm, and Sarah felt them settle over her like a shield. When he was gone, she stepped outside, the air crisp with the scent of pine and earth. The garden was small, its rows overgrown but orderly, and she found a hoe in the shed, its handle worn smooth. She worked through the morning, pulling weeds, her hands finding a rhythm that eased the knots in her chest. The labor was grounding, a reminder that she could build something, even if her past still haunted her. She glanced at the horizon, half expecting to see the man from Boston, his shadow a constant threat. But the valley was quiet, the cattle grazing peacefully in the distance. By noon, Caleb returned, his head dusted with frost, his eyes scanning the garden with quiet approval. "You've got a knack for it," he said, setting a bucket of water by the porch. "Didn't expect that." Sarah wiped her hands on her apron, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "I grew up on a farm," she said, the truth slipping out before she could stop it. Before everything. She didn't elaborate, and Caleb didn't press, but the shared moment felt like a bridge, fragile but real. He handed her a pair of gloves, their leather softened from use. "These'll help," he said, his voice gruff but kind. "They were my wife's." The admission hung between them, heavy with unspoken loss, and Sarah took the gloves, her fingers brushing his. The touch was brief, but it sent a warmth through her, a spark she wasn't ready to name. They worked together that afternoon, Caleb mending a fence while Sarah turned the soil, their movements a quiet dance. She watched him from the corner of her eye, noting the strength in his hands, the sorrow in his posture. He was a man who'd known loss, just as she had, and the realization made her feel less alone, though she didn't dare say it. That evening, as they sat by the fire, Sarah mended a tear in one of Caleb's shirts, her needle flashing in the light. He whittled at a piece of wood, shaping it into something she couldn't yet discern, his hands steady despite the weight of his thoughts. The silence was comfortable now, less fraught with suspicion, and Sarah felt a stirring in her chest, a longing to stay, to build something here. "You don't ask questions," she said suddenly, her voice cutting through the quiet. "About me, I mean." "Why?" Caleb's knife paused, his eyes meeting hers. "Figure you'll tell me when you're ready," he said. "Or you won't. Either way, you're here, and that's enough for now." His words were a gift, one she didn't know how to repay. She nodded, her hand stilling on the needle, and felt the weight of her secrets lighten, just a fraction. Outside, the wind whispered through the pines, and Sarah let herself believe, for a moment, that she could be safe here, that the man from Boston wouldn't find her, that the woman she'd been might find a way to heal. The Colorado sun climbed higher each day, thawing the frost that clung to Caleb Morrow's ranch, though the chill of early spring lingered in the air. Sarah moved through the routine of the ranch with a quiet determination, her hands finding purpose in the garden, kitchen, the mending basket. The house, once a stranger's domain, began to feel like a refuge, its simple comforts, clean linens, a warm hearth, the scent of baking bread, easing the weight of her past. Yet her secrets remained, a shadow that followed her as surely as the man she feared was still hunting her. Each night, she checked the windows, her fingers brushing the satchel where she kept a small knife, a reminder of the life she'd fled. Caleb was a steady presence, his kindness woven into the fabric of their days. He rose before dawn to tend the cattle, his boots leaving tracks in the dew-soaked grass, and returned with small offerings, a sack of apples from town, a length of cloth for a new apron. Sarah watched him, noting the care in his movements, the way he stacked firewood with precision, the way his eyes softened when he spoke to her. He didn't ask about her past, didn't demand the truth behind her claim to be Sarah Ellis, but she felt his curiosity, his quiet hope, and it stirred a longing in her she wasn't ready to name. One morning, as the sky glowed pink, Sarah found a pair of boots by the door, polished and set out as if waiting for her. They were sturdy, the leather soft from use, and a note tucked inside read, "For the garden." She glanced at Caleb, who was stirring coffee at the stove, his back to her. "You didn't have to," she said, her voice soft but firm, testing the weight of his kindness. He turned, his eyes meeting hers. "They'll keep your feet dry," he said simply, no trace of expectation in his tone. They were hers, my wife's. She'd want them used. The mention of his late wife hung between them, a quiet acknowledgement of his own losses, and Sarah felt a pang of connection, a shared understanding of grief. She slipped on the boots, their fit snug and warm, and stepped outside to the garden. The soil was rich, yielding to her hoe, and she worked with a focus that quieted her fears. Caleb joined her later, mending a gate nearby, his hammer's steady rhythm a counterpoint to her own. They didn't speak, but their shared labor felt like a conversation, each movement a step towards something unspoken. Sarah caught herself watching him, the way his hands gripped the hammer, the way his brow furrowed in concentration, and felt a warmth in her chest that both comforted and frightened her. That afternoon, as they sat on the porch, sharing a plate of biscuits Sarah had baked, Caleb spoke, his voice low. "You're good at this," he said, nodding toward the garden, "like you've always been here." Sarah's fingers tightened around her biscuit, the compliment stirring a mix of pride and guilt. "I learned young," she said, her voice careful. "My mother taught me before." She stopped, the memory of her mother's gentle hands overshadowed by the man who'd come after, his threats driving her from Boston. She wanted to tell Caleb, to unburden herself, but the words caught, held back by fear of what he might think. He didn't press, only nodded, his eyes on the horizon. "You don't have to say it," he said, "but if you ever want to, I'm listening." His words were a gift, simple and unassuming, and Sarah felt a crack in the wall she'd built around her heart. The next day, Caleb took her to town, the wagon loaded with eggs to trade. Sarah sat beside him, the boots warm on her feet, the new apron tied neatly at her waist. Clearwater bustled with life, miners haggling, children chasing a hoop, the blacksmith's hammer ringing in the distance. But Sarah's eyes darted to every stranger, searching for the man from Boston, his face etched in her memory. Caleb noticed, his hand steady on the reins, and leaned closer. "You're safe here," he said, his voice low. "No one's getting past me." She nodded, her throat tight, and followed him into the general store. The shopkeeper, a kindly woman with gray curls, greeted Sarah warmly, offering her a peppermint stick. "You're a sight for sore eyes," the woman said. "Caleb's been alone too long." Sarah smiled, the words warming her, though she felt the weight of her deception. She wasn't sure she was the Sarah he'd waited for, not entirely. Back at the ranch, Sarah helped Caleb unload the supplies, her hands brushing his as they passed a sack of flour. The touch was brief, but it sent a spark through her, a reminder of how close they'd grown. That evening, as they sat by the fire, Sarah mended a tear in Caleb's coat, a needle moving with practiced ease. He whittled, shaping a small bird, its wings delicate under his knife. The silence was comfortable, but Sarah felt the pull of her secrets, the need to speak growing stronger. "I wasn't always Sarah," she said suddenly, her voice trembling. Caleb's knife paused, but he didn't look up, giving her space. "My name was Clara once, before I ran. There was a man in Boston. He wanted me for something I couldn't give. I took Sarah's name to escape him." She stopped, her hands shaking, waiting for his judgment. Caleb set the knife down, his eyes meeting hers, steady and kind. "You're here now," he said. "Sarah, Clara doesn't matter. You're the woman who came to my ranch, and that's enough." Her eyes burned, and she looked away. The weight of his acceptance almost too much to bear. She wanted to believe him, wanted to trust the life they were building, but the fear of the man from Boston lingered, a shadow she couldn't outrun. As the fire crackled, Caleb reached across the table, his hand resting near hers, not touching but close enough to feel. Sarah felt the stirrings of love, fragile but real, and let herself hope, for the first time, that she might find a home here with him. The Colorado spring deepened, the valley around Caleb Morrow's ranch bursting into green, the air sweet with the scent of blooming sage. Sarah, or Clara, as she confessed, moved through the days with a quiet resolve, her hands busy with the garden, her heart wrestling with the truth she'd laid bare. The confession had shifted something between her and Caleb, a fragile trust taking root in the space where secrets had once stood. The ranch house, with its sturdy walls and warm hearth, felt more like home, yet the shadow of her past lingered, a fear that the man from Boston could still find her, unraveling the life she was building. Caleb's kindness was a steady anchor. He rose each morning to tend the cattle, his broad frame moving through the dawn with a purpose that grounded Sarah. He left small gestures in his wake, a basket of wildflowers on the table, a repaired rake for the garden, a gentle word when her eyes grew distant. She watched him, noting the lines etched by grief in his face, the way his hands, strong from years of labor, handled tools with a tenderness that belied their strength. Her heart stirred, a mix of gratitude and something deeper, a longing she was only beginning to name. One evening, as the sky burned gold, Sarah sat on the porch, mending a quilt, its patches a patchwork of Caleb's late wife's life. Caleb joined her, a tin mug of coffee in his hand, and sat in the chair beside her, his presence warm and steady. The silence was comfortable, but Sarah felt the weight of her confession, the need to share more. "I was running for more than just a man," she said, her voice low, the needle pausing in her hand. "My father, he sold me to pay a debt. I was 16, and the man who bought me, he was cruel. I escaped, but he's been hunting me ever since." Caleb's jaw tightened, his eyes darkening with a quiet fury, but his voice remained gentle. "He won't find you here," he said, his words a vow. "Not while I'm around." He didn't touch her, didn't press for more, but the strength in his voice wrapped around her like a shield. Sarah's eyes burned, and she looked away, the quilt blurring in her vision. "I don't know why you trust me," she said. "I lied about who I was." Caleb leaned forward, his hands clasped around the mug. "You told me the truth when you were ready," he said. "That's more than most would do. And I see you, Clara, Sarah, whatever you call yourself. You're here, working this land with me. That's what matters." The words settled over her, easing the knot in her chest. She wanted to reach for his hand, to bridge the distance between them, but fear held her back, not of Caleb, but of the hope he offered. She nodded, her needle moving again, and let the moment linger, the porch a quiet sanctuary as the stars emerged. The next morning, Sarah woke to find a small package by her bedside, a shawl, soft and blue, its edges neatly hemmed, a note tucked inside read, "For the chill." She draped it over her shoulders, the fabric warm against her skin, and found Caleb in the kitchen, stirring oats. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft, and he nodded, his eyes warm but guarded, as if he too felt the pull between them. They worked together that day, Sarah tending the garden while Caleb repaired a corral. Their movements were a quiet dance, their glances meeting across the yard, each one charged with unspoken feelings. When Sarah struggled with a heavy bucket of water, Caleb was there, his hands brushing hers as he took it, the touch sending a spark through her. "Let me," he said, his voice gruff, and she stepped back, her cheeks warm, watching as he carried it with ease. That afternoon, as they sat by the stream that ran through the ranch, sharing a loaf of bread, Sarah spoke again. You don't talk about her, she said, her voice hesitant. Your wife, what was she like? Caleb's hand paused, a crumb falling to the grass. Mary was kind, he said, his voice rough with memory. Loved this land, loved making it ours. Fever took her too fast. I couldn't save her. He looked at Sarah, his eyes raw. When I got that letter saying you died, it was like losing her again. Sarah's heart ached, and she reached out, her hand resting on his arm. I'm here now, she said, echoing his earlier words. I'm not going anywhere. The touch was brief, but it held a promise, a connection she couldn't deny. That evening, as they sat by the fire, Sarah felt the pull of Caleb's presence, his quiet strength a balm to her fears. He whittled, shaping a small bird, its wings delicate under his knife, and she watched, her heart swelling with a love she wasn't ready to speak. But the peace was fragile. In town, she'd seen a man lingering by the saloon, his eyes sharp, his coat patched, a face too close to the one from Boston. She hadn't told Caleb, hadn't wanted to break the spell of their days, but the fear was there, a shadow waiting to strike. As night fell, Sarah checked the windows, her knife close, her eyes scanning the darkness. Caleb noticed, his hand resting on the rifle by the door. Something's wrong, he said, not a question. Tell me. She hesitated, then spoke, her voice trembling. There's a man. I saw him in town. I think he's the one I ran from. Her hand shook, and Caleb stepped closer, his presence steadying her. He won't touch you, he said, his voice low, fierce. I swear it. His hand hovered near hers, not touching but close, and Sarah felt the weight of his promise, the strength of his resolve. As the fire burned low, Sarah sat closer to Caleb, the shawl warm around her shoulders, the bird he'd carved resting on the table. She didn't know if the man from Boston would come, didn't know if she could fully trust the love growing between them. But for now, she let herself believe in Caleb, in the home they were building, in the possibility of a future free from fear. The Colorado spring bloomed fully, the valley around Caleb Morrow's ranch alive with wildflowers and the hum of new life. Sarah Clara, as she had confessed, moved through the days with a quiet strength, her hand steady in the garden, her heart opening to the possibility of a future with Caleb. The ranch house, once a place of solitude, now thrummed with their shared rhythm, her baking bread, his mending fences, their evenings by the fire filled with soft words and softer silences. Yet the shadow of her past loomed. The man from Boston, a specter she couldn't outrun, his presence in town a threat that tightened her chest with every glance at the horizon. Caleb's love was a steady light, his kindness woven into every gesture. He'd carved a small wooden box for her, its lid etched with a delicate flower, and left it by her bedside with a note. For your keepsakes. Sarah had traced the carving, her fingers trembling, and felt the weight of his care, a love that asked nothing in return. She watched him now, his broad frame moving through the corral, his hands gentle with the horses, and felt her heart shift, the fear of her past giving way to a hope she hadn't dared embrace. One evening, as the sky burned red, Sarah sat on the porch, the shawl Caleb had given her draped over her shoulders. He joined her, his hands clasped around a tin mug, his eyes on the stars emerging above. The silence was warm, but Sarah felt the need to speak, to bridge the final gap between them. I want to stay, she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her chest. Not as Sarah Ellis, but as me. Clara, if you'll have me. Caleb turned to her, his eyes soft but fierce. Clara, he said, her true name a vow on his lips. I've wanted you here since you stepped off that stagecoach. Name doesn't change that. He reached for her hand, his touch gentle but firm, and Sarah felt a spark, a warmth that chased away the chill of her fears. She squeezed his hand, her heart swelling with a love she could no longer deny. The next morning, as they worked side by side in the garden, Sarah felt a peace she hadn't known in years. Caleb showed her how to prune the young apple trees, his hands guiding hers, their laughter mingling with the breeze. But the peace shattered when a rider appeared at the edge of the ranch, his horse kicking up dust, his face shadowed by a familiar patched coat. Sarah's breath caught, her hand tightening on the pruning knife, and Caleb stepped in front of her, his rifle already in hand. "Stay back," he said, his voice low, and Sarah nodded, her heart pounding as she retreated to the porch. The rider dismounted, his movements slow, deliberate, and Sarah recognized him. The man from Boston, his eyes cold and predatory, the same man who'd bought her from her father years ago. "You've got something of mine," the man said, his voice oily, his gaze fixed on Sarah. "Claire, isn't it? Time to come home." Caleb's jaw tightened, his rifle steady. "She's not yours," he said, his voice a growl. "Leave now, or you won't leave at all." The man smirked, his hand twitching toward his gun, but Caleb was faster, his rifle aimed true. "Don't test me," Caleb said, and the man froze, his eyes narrowing. Sarah's heart raced, her knife gripped tightly, but she saw the strength in Caleb, the unyielding resolve at his stance, and felt a surge of courage. The confrontation was swift, tense standoff, the man's bravado crumbling under Caleb's steady gaze. "This ain't over," the man spat, but he mounted his horse and rode off, his shadow shrinking into the valley. Caleb lowered his rifle, his shoulders tense, and turned to Sarah, his eyes searching hers. "You all right?" he asked, his voice soft but urgent. She nodded, her hand shaking as she dropped the knife. "I'm sorry," she whispered, tears burning her eyes. "I brought this to you." Caleb stepped closer, his hand cupping her face, his touch grounding her. "You brought yourself," he said. "That's all I need." He pulled her into his arms, and Sarah clung to him, her tears soaking his shirt, the fear of her past dissolving in the warmth of his embrace. In the days that followed, Caleb spoke to the sheriff, ensuring the man from Boston was watched, his threat diminished by the town's loyalty to one of their own. Sarah worked beside Caleb, her hand steady in the garden, her heart lighter with each day. The townsfolk welcomed her, calling her Clara now, their smiles a testament to her place among them. She taught the children at the schoolhouse, her voice growing stronger, her laughter mingling with theirs. One evening, as summer approached, Caleb led Sarah to the hill overlooking the ranch, the wildflowers swaying in the breeze. He took her hand, his eyes bright with a question he'd held for weeks. "Clara," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "I don't have much, but I have this land, this home, and my heart. Will you share them with me?" Sarah's breath caught, her eyes burning with tears of joy. "Yes," she said, her voice steady, and she kissed him, the touch soft but sure, sealing a promise that felt like home. They stood together, the valley stretching before them, and Sarah felt the scars of her past fade, not in their memory, but in their power over her. As the seasons turned, Clara and Caleb built a life together, their love a foundation stronger than the ranch's stone walls. The man from Boston never returned, his threat buried in the dust of the trail. Clara's laughter filled the house, her hands shaping a garden, a home, a family. Caleb carved a new box for her, filled with their shared keepsakes, letters, a pressed flower, a promise of forever. And as they stood on the porch, hand in hand, watching the sun set over their land, Clara knew she found her place, not as a bride who never came, but as a woman who'd found her way home.